In 2020, there were allegations made against a prominent Christian speaker and apologist, the late Ravi Zacharias. They began to come to light, and after a 4-month investigation, they found that he had leveraged his reputation as a world-famous apologist to abuse massage therapists in the United States and around the world. He hid his abusive behavior. He lured victims by building trust spiritually with them. He offered funds straight out of his ministry, and his legacy was irreparably damaged. In 2020, Bill Hybels, the pastor of a very large Willow Creek church, was accused of sexual misconduct up to and including an affair, and at least some of the allegations were found to be true, and he resigned from his ministry in disgrace. We could go on, couldn't we? If you've been alive for any length of time, you know these are in every decade. In the 1980s, Jim Bakker, a very popular evangelist, was caught in the sexual abuse scandal. Jimmy Swaggart, in the 1990s, huge influence. He was caught with prostitutes. Bill Gothard, Ted Haggard, and on and on. And those are just the big names. There are so many more. Youth pastors, senior pastors, volunteers, caught up in this impropriety, this sexual impropriety that ruins their careers or their impact. And that's just in the church. That doesn't even account what's happening in the world around us. How does that happen, and why is it so common? Well, Jesus is using the same formula in what we're looking at today that he's been using all the way through. And the formula is simply this. He says, look, this is what you've heard. You've heard it talked about this way. This is what you've been taught. But I'm going to tell you what the heart of God really is towards this topic, right? It's kind of like, this is what you heard. Let me explain it to you in its fullness. And so this is what he does. Matthew 25, 27 to 30, he says this. You've heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out, throw it away. It's better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. If your right hand causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to go to hell. And I can almost hear what everybody's thinking. I don't want to hear this. Or, I can hardly wait till they hear this. In my experience, the church as a whole, they've spoken into this, but not always very well. Anytime you approach this topic of sexual purity or behavior, it can do one of two things. It can lead to guilt and shame really, really easily, right? People beat themselves up. I should do better. I can't believe I did that again. No, I blew it. I'm ashamed of the past. I can't believe this happened in my life. And so there's all this guilt and this shame that heaps up, and it really can get in the way of you and God and relationships with other people. Or there's the people that sit back and go, I don't struggle with that. If all you other people could get it together, we wouldn't have to worry about this. If guys could just stop being pigs, we'd be fine. I've heard these things. People say them. And they think, if you just do it, we'd all be good. And there's a level of that. And might I suggest that neither of those is what Jesus is shooting for here? In fact, what I hope this morning is that you can be both challenged and have hope when it comes to this topic. So, before we jump into the words of Jesus directly, I have to talk about two difficulties that come up whenever you talk about this topic. Okay? Here's difficulty number one. What culture says in regards to sexuality is always changing. It's never consistent. And if you've been alive for any length of time, you know this, right? The young people today who look at the 40 and 50-year-olds and say, oh, you guys are so old-fashioned. They don't realize that 30 years ago, that's what we told the people, and then that 30 years before that, that's what they told the people. I mean, it just goes on, right? It's always changing. It's always morphing. It's like a moving target. You know, we had the sexual revolution 50, 60 years ago. It changed the mores completely, right? Technology has taken things like pornography and made them into, multi-billion-dollar industries. In our current culture, the idea of having self-control, people are like, what are you talking about? Why would you do that, right? It's a whole new thing. The philosophy of today, which is not the same as it was 30 years ago, is anyone, anytime, anyway. Do you know that adultery was only decriminalized in some states 20 years ago, and that about a quarter of the states, it's still a felony or a misdemeanor? Who knew? Laws on the books. Nobody would prosecute them, and they've said that they're pointless at this point. But did you know that was actually there? Well, we didn't, but that's because it's changed. Things look different today than they did before. And what is celebrated and promoted today was not celebrated and promoted 30 years ago and will not be celebrated or promoted 30 years from now. And that is a problem, because if we try and base what we think is right when it comes to sexuality on the culture, it's just a moving target. We'll never hit it because it's always changing. And the problem becomes if we try and live with a moral code that begins with us, which is what the world does, if the moral code is me, then it never goes past that. If God's not in the moral code, then he never will be, right? It kind of falls out. So that's problem number one, which leads to problem number two, which is this one right here. And you'll hear this all the time, which is there's an implied value today which sexual freedom equals fun and joy, any self-control or restrictions equals joylessness. Right? People don't always say this. Some say it straight out, like, look, why would you put restrictions on this? It's natural, it's fun. The more freedom we have, the better we are off as a society. And do you know how we know this? Because when they use words about the system today, do you know what they say? Our culture is more liberated than the old cultures. This country is more liberated than this country. What's the implication? Freedom is better. Freedom to do what you want when you want, that's the good thing. That's the way it should be. Not these repressive old cultures. Listen to the world talk about anything that encourages restrictions or abstinence or anything like that. Completely frowned upon. By the way, the fact that there is literally no data, no study that's ever been done to back up that belief is irrelevant. People don't care because they want to do what they want to do. So into all this, we bring the message of Jesus, who, when he was speaking at the time, right? Remember, he's speaking to his disciples, to the crowd, to the Pharisees. Again, he's bringing this counter-revolutionary thought to this part of life. So he says, you've heard that it was said, you should not commit adultery. And again, he's going back to, well, here's what you were taught in the past, that, and this was the seventh commandment, right? Going back to the 10 Commandments. This is what you've heard. Now, you have to understand the context here. So he's speaking primarily to Jews. Now, the Jews thought they had it all together because they looked at the Roman and the Greek culture in which they were immersed, and they said, we are not like them. Because in the Roman and the Greek culture, all bets were off. And the things that they did and their behaviors they had and the fact that they could have, it was not only allowed but encouraged. You had your wife, and then you had your mistress, and then your mistress number two, and homosexuality was celebrated, and pedophilia was totally encouraged and tolerated. And so the Jewish people are in the midst of this kind of culture, like the worship of the gods. A lot of it was sexual in nature. So the Jews would say, we're not like that. We've got it together. Our law says, do not commit adultery. We just follow the law. And interestingly enough, in Jewish law, when they would say this, what they primarily meant was being unfaithful sexually to your spouse. That's what they meant, right? It was the very strict term of adultery. And what's ironic in some ways is that the Jewish people were far less concerned with the sexual sin, but because of how the law was written, it was that when you did that, that was like theft. And that was a bigger deal to them. So Jesus looks at all this and says, you're not getting it. You've heard this. You've said, if you just don't do this, you're good. This is the line, right? They would say, look, this is the line. This is what God said. Anything up to this line is okay. Just don't step over it. And if you think that's a 2,000-year-old thing, you know that's not true. Because I would get a show of hands and say, how many of you, when you were in college or youth group, the prevailing question was, how far can I go before it's sin? Is that sin? I don't know, because if you just go to here, now if you cross over to here, that's a problem. But as long as you're on this side of the line, you're good, right? And it was always like trying to find how close can I get to the edge before I fall off the cliff. This happens all the time. And Jesus' response is actually the same as he gave when he talked to him about murder, when he said, look, the problem isn't murder, it's anger. And here he says the problem isn't adultery, it's lust. He says, look, here's the issue, that sexual purity actually starts in your heart, not in your actions. He raises the stakes, and he goes after the heart again. And in doing so, he expands the definition, because for the Jewish people, they were just looking at, look, if you're married, don't stray out of marriage. And Jesus is saying, no, 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 no. This is about whether you're married or not married. This is about whether you've already gone that way or not, if you're young or if you're old. This is everybody in every situation. We're talking about sexual purity, and it's not just about married people. And so I see a couple things in here that I think that are really important. Here's one. Intent matters. It's a brand new way of thinking, because the people then, just like a lot of people are now, they're looking for the externals, right? So the Jews were looking for the law of Moses. What did Moses say? What did he tell us to do? It's pretty straightforward. You either do it or you don't. You either obey or you don't. The reasons behind it, if you passed or failed, were kind of irrelevant. It was just more of like, well, did you pass or did you fail? And what Jesus is saying, look, I need you to shift from this external way of thinking to an internal way of thinking. What you think matters. What's going on in your head matters. This is called adultery of the heart. Which every time you see heart, in the scriptures, it's talking about your intellect, your affections, your will. It's that whole inside part. And what Jesus is saying is, look, your fantasies matter to God. And now, this is where we have to kind of flesh this out a little bit. In church culture, at least in my experience, whenever anybody reads this verse, do you know what they think of immediately? Men, you and your pornography. That is not what this only means. The word that is used here for lust is any type of wish fulfillment for something that isn't yours. So it could be fantasizing about a spouse who doesn't pay enough attention to you. You might be thinking about someone else who could better meet your emotional and financial needs. And it means indulging in those thoughts, giving them space, consideration, imagination. And it can be from books, it can be from TV, it can be from movies. It can even be from sitting around having coffee with your friends and you walk away going, man, I wish I had a marriage like that one. Jesus' point is that the physical act of adultery is the end of the road. But it begins in your heart, which means simply this, that sexual purity is developed in small things. Sexual sin is a step-by-step road to more and more. See, the religious conventions of the day, the thing that Jesus is speaking into was, stay true to your marriage, don't sleep around. That's what the Greeks and the Romans do. We're not going to do that. And if you do that, you're good. And Jesus says, look, I want you to understand, and we're going to talk about this in a second, why this is true. He's saying what has been proven over and over and over and over for 2,000 years, which is it's small step after small step after small compromise after small compromise that ends you in a place of trouble. Happens a little bit of time. Do you know adultery never starts out full-blown? No one ever wakes up in the morning and says, today would be a good day for this. Every one of those stories that I shared at the beginning, people who were caught, their careers ruined, their marriages wrecked, every single one of them, when you hear the stories, started here and compromised a little bit. And you know why? Because it starts in the heart. And Jesus says, no, you have to understand, sexual purity is developed in the small things because actions always begin in your heart. That's where actions start. Every action you've ever taken, every time you've ever stumbled in this area, it all started in your heart before it ever got to that place. Billy Graham famously had incredibly stringent rules on this because he said, I can't compromise in these little things. Small thoughts, little fantasies are indulged for just a little bit longer. Oh, it's just a cup of coffee with somebody. No, it's just that personal conversation at the office at the end of the workday. All things that we're like, it's not that big a deal. Yeah, it is. Physical sin when it comes to sex always begins with heart sin. And Jesus wanted his listeners to know that you could go through your entire life never cheating on your spouse and be regularly sinning. The good news, of course, is that if you guard your heart, it fixes your actions. Because if you're guarding your heart, you never get to there. Now, why is Jesus making such a big deal of this? Because in our culture, and if you're a young person or someone who's going this, like, oh, come on, this is all so old-fashioned. Why is Jesus making such a big deal of this? Why does this even matter? Well, look what Jesus says next. If your right eye causes you to stumble, and by the way, the reason he uses the right was in antiquity, your right side of your body was considered the power side. That was the more influential side, right? Just most people being right-handed. If your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away. And if your hand causes you to stumble, cut it off. Why? Is he actually advocating for self-mutilation? No, of course not. But here's what he wanted his listeners to understand is that sexual sin is destructive. So, you got to deal with it severely. And it's very interesting because what he's talking about here is a trap. There's a word here. If you read through this, he says, if it causes you to stumble, the word that he's using is a Greek word. You'll recognize it. It's called scandalon, from where we get our word scandal, or, ironically, slander. And the idea behind that word is setting a trap or a snare. In other words, the temptation to compromise sexual purity is a trap. Now, you've got lots of hunter people here. I wouldn't have to explain this. I'd have to explain this more in New Jersey. But in Delaware, you all get this. But have you ever thought about a snare or a trap? Right? A snare is hidden. It's not visible. If it was, the animal wouldn't go into it. Right? That's what we do with the snare. We like, okay, well, I'm going to put it in a way where they don't see it. Traps, same kind of thing. What a trap does is we take a trap and we put peanut butter on it. We put cheese on it. We do something that promises easy returns. And the animal says, oh, look at this tasty thing that I get to eat. It's right here. I didn't even have to scrounge for it. It's in the middle of the room. And it's good and it's easy. And so we say things like, oh, come on, I'm just looking. I'm not even married yet. When I'm married, I'll go the distance. Oh, come on. I'm just being friendly. Oh, you know what? It's just flirting. And in a second, you're trapped. This is the picture that Jesus is presenting. He's saying, guys, you don't understand what you're playing with here. Sexual sin always promises what it cannot deliver. And the irony is that we live in a culture that will ask us or invite us to the very behavior that it punishes us for. Isn't that interesting? Like they're like, oh, come on, do whatever you want. It's no big deal. Forget about all that moral stuff. And then when they catch you, what does the news do? Oh, I can't believe it. Look what happened to them. Like, well, hold on a second. You just said this was okay, right? It's a double standard. It kind of goes along with our culture. No life or marriage has ever been made better by cheating. It is only ever damaged, sometimes catastrophically. And if you are unmarried here, hear me clearly. No marriage has ever been made better by sex before marriage. Only damaged. And I could tell you story after story after story. Because I have had countless people sit in my office and tell me how they wish they hadn't done it. And I've yet in my life to have someone say, oh, best decision I ever made. Regardless of what you hear in the world today, there is no such thing as consequence-free sexuality. Everything is connected. And sex before marriage will damage your future marriage and your future relationships. Pornography, fantasizing of any type will lessen the quality of your marriage relationship in multiple ways. Intimacy will be destroyed. Happiness and joy will be lessened. So hear this clearly. The only legitimate source of sexual satisfaction is your spouse. In every way. And so Jesus says, look, I understand all this. Look, I'm the one who made it. So let me tell you, this is a trap. if something's happening, if you're tempted in this direction, you are better off to lose your eye or to lose your hand, one being, your thoughts, the other being actions, right? They're kind of symbolic of both. To deal with it ruthlessly. This is not one of those things you can I'll get around to it. Jesus says, look, and he's using hyperbole, although weirdly enough, in the Middle Ages, there were some monastic orders that took this literally and cut things off. And it's not what Jesus was going for here. He's trying to use hyperbole because he says he wants them to understand that unchecked, this will destroy your life. He's not advocating for self-mutilation. He just wants his listeners to understand. He wants you to understand. He wants me to understand what a big deal this is. The one who plays with fire will get burned. How many of you remember the story of Aaron Ralston? Anybody know that name? You will when I tell you the story. He was a hiker. He was hiking in Utah. And as he was hiking, he accidentally loosened an 800-pound rock in a narrow area, and it pinned his right arm under the rock. Do you remember this? He was pinned. He remained there with little food and water for 5 days. Let me show you. Here's a picture of him, because he actually had a video camera. This is him taking a picture of himself while the ordeal was going on. For 5 days, he tried everything he could think of. And he finally came to the place where it was a choice between, I'm going to be dead in about 12 hours, or I got to cut it off. This is a graphic picture of what Jesus is talking about. He's saying, this will kill you. It will wreck your life. It will wreck your relationships. It has the potential to damage everything about you. You need to run and get rid of this as fast as you can. And if it means cutting off your arm, do it. You cannot treat sexual sin lightly. Do you know what's ironic about that story? And I read it this week. He in his own words, he tells the story. It's crazy, but he kind of goes through how he got to his decision in the end and what he had to do. It's awful. But you know what he says? He says, I went hiking alone. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. No one knew where I was. No one could come and help me. If he had involved other people, none of that would have happened. And yet, especially in the church, we think, I am not telling anybody about my struggles here. I'm not involving anybody else in this. I'm not talking to anybody else about this. Are you crazy? I will solve this alone, and then later I'll tell everybody about my victory. We see over and over as people unpack this later in the New Testament that we need to be involving people in this process. Because if you're worried about what people think, remember that your spiritual health and relationship is far more important than your pride. So what do we do with all this? Aren't you glad you came to church today? Trust me, this was a hard week. What do you do with all this? The goal here from Jesus is not to make us work harder or to try and follow better rules. That's not what he's doing here. It's not to shame and guilt us into better behavior. So I want to remind you of a couple things before we tell you the last point. Here's number one. The Holy Spirit never traffics in guilt and shame. Okay? Hear me clearly on this. Satan will try and get you to question who you are. He will cause you to feel horrible about yourself, run yourself down. I can't believe who I am. He'll try and make you feel worthless and small. Your sin nature will encourage you to keep it to yourself and not let anybody in. Those voices need to be rejected. The Holy Spirit will convict, and he'll let you know where you need to change. And he'll invite you into transparency with other people, but he will never demean you. He will call you to repent, and he'll call you to something greater, but that's because your identity with him is already set. That's number one. And number two, as I alluded to already, this is not about following rules better. In fact, the entire point Jesus is making here is you can't follow the rules better. The Pharisees said it was supposed to be this. It's not that. It's this. And none of you can do this. This is not about saying, well, I'm just going to do better. You cannot behave your way into a right relationship and a right standing with God. Maybe I'll throw in a third one. Sexual sin is not the unpardonable sin. And some of you have histories that you've been carrying with you for a long time. And you don't need to. You can have freedom. So when Jesus is going through all this, I think it comes to this. That letting God change my heart will change my approach to sexuality. The Pharisees had all these rules about adultery. They thought if you followed them, you were good with God. And in doing so, they missed the heart of God. It's so much deeper. It's about intent. It's about our hearts. And when our hearts and our intents and our desires are off, it's sinful. And it leads to all kinds of problems. So when he's calling us out of our sin, when he's inviting us out of our sin, he's doing it for our good. You know, we just celebrated his death and resurrection. You know that was for our sin, including this. His desire is for us to live righteously. In this case, with regards to our sexuality. Because he actually knows better than we do and better than our culture what's at stake in our lives. And the more we surrender, the more our hearts and desires change. That's what he's inviting us to, right? If we focus on behavior modification, we can end up with an outward form of morality, which is what the Pharisees had, and still be sinful and drive the sin deeper. And here's the good news. God can change your heart. You can't. God can. I was having a conversation about this last week. A wise person in our congregation by the name of Jim O'Day. And he said something, and I said, do you mind if I quote you on this? Because he said, look, I stopped doing some things because the reason for doing them stopped. When Jesus is talking about sexual sin, he's like, guys, it starts in your heart. You need to turn that over to God. You need to surrender that. He'll change it. He'll work in there. And when he does, all of a sudden, the reason that you're doing these things, the reason you're having all these issues, that goes away. And when the reason for it goes away, because your heart is different, the action and the sins go away as well. Now, sometimes that happens quickly. Sometimes that happens slowly. Living the way of God's kingdom is the path to life as it was meant to be. God is not here to wreck your fun. Do you understand that God didn't create a bunch of rules and then say, you know what? I need to create people to follow my rules. He created people. He said, I love them so much. I want them to experience life the way they were supposed to experience it. So let me show them what that looks like. He knew how good it would be when we lived out of our sexuality the way he intended. How positive, how affirming, how amazing, how much fun it would be. And he knew that for that to happen, he would have to die. And I don't know if it seems weird to you to know that Jesus died so you could have a restored sexuality. But it's true. So we've been asking this question every week about what do we do with this? How does this line up? How does our life line up? So may I just be a little more specific this week? Because we're going to close with a song. I asked the team to come up. And as we do this last song, I'm going to encourage you to do a couple things. First of all, do not stand. Just stay seated. Because I want you to think, and I want you to consider some questions here. Here's question number one, if I can get it. Where is the Holy Spirit convicting you? And what I specifically mean is, where have you made concessions that you don't want to give up? And you know where they are. They're the things you're like, oh, yeah, I know that's not really good for me, but I just keep doing it because, it kind of feels good in the moment. I like that fantasy. I like thinking about that, whatever. Where is that for you? Number two, in what ways then do you need to invite Jesus to change your heart? Realizing that you can't change your own. So with the answer to the first question, what are those things? Confess those. Repent. Say, God, I don't want to do this anymore. I want to be done with this. I want to change direction. And then number two, what ways do I need to do it? Well, then make that invitation. Genuinely saying, Jesus, okay, I'm fighting with this, I've dealt with this guilt and shame. I want to be done. And then lastly, what is he asking me to cooperate and surrender in? In other words, what boundaries do you need to set? What boundaries do you need to reset? What are behaviors that need to change? How do I cooperate with what he is doing in my heart? And then do it.